I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're watching over a child who isn't yours, setting a table for someone who never says thank you, or just hoping to be seen. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart. The morning alarm hadn't even sounded when Alicia Rodriguez opened her eyes in the cramped studio apartment she rented in Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles. The thin walls carried the sounds of her neighbors, a crying baby, the distant hum of morning television, the clatter of dishes being washed in preparation for another day of work. At 42, Alicia had learned to wake before the sun, her internal clock attuned to the needs of others rather than her own desires. Her calloused hands moved automatically through her morning routine, brewing instant coffee in a chipped mug, checking the weather on her cracked phone screen, and pulling on the same navy blue uniform she wore 6 days a week. The fabric had grown soft from countless washes, but it still held the faint scent of the expensive fabric softener from the Martinez mansion where she worked. That smell was both comfort and reminder of the invisible line she crossed each day between two worlds. The bus ride from East LA to Beverly Hills took 90 minutes on a good day, longer when traffic crawled along the 101 freeway like a metallic river of frustration. Alicia pressed her face against the window, watching the city transform as they moved west. The graffitied walls and corner tiendas gave way to manicured lawns and Mediterranean-style homes, each transition marking another step away from everything familiar and toward the gleaming fortress where she spent most of her waking hours. She thought of Isabella and Mateo as the bus lurched through morning traffic, their sleepy faces the first sight that would greet her when she arrived at the Martinez estate. At 7 and 3 years old, respectively, they had become the heartbeat of her existence, their laughter and tears more precious to her than any paycheck she'd ever received. Their father, Richard Martinez, remained a distant figure in their lives, present in body when business allowed, but emotionally unreachable, as if paternal love were a luxury his portfolio couldn't afford. The Martinez fortune, built through shrewd real estate investments and a tech startup that had gone public during the dot-com boom, sat comfortably in the 9-figure range. Richard's net worth fluctuated with market conditions, his wealth distributed across stocks, bonds, Bitcoin holdings, and properties scattered from Malibu to Miami. Yet for all his financial acumen, he seemed unable to calculate the value of the woman who held his family together with quiet strength and unconditional devotion. Alicia's own story began 42 years earlier in a different Los Angeles, one where dreams competed with survival and love often wore the face of sacrifice. Born to parents who had crossed the border with nothing but hope and determination, she learned early that worth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the depth of care one could provide to others. Her mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families in Hancock Park, coming home each evening with stories of children who had everything except the thing they needed most, someone to truly see them. When Alicia lost her own child at 26, a son who lived only 3 days, his tiny fingers never quite strong enough to hold on to life, something fundamental shifted inside her. The grief carved out a space in her heart that could only be filled by loving other people's children with the fierce tenderness she would have given her own. That loss became her superpower, transforming pain into an almost supernatural ability to nurture, protect, and heal. 3 years ago, when Richard Martinez's wife had finally abandoned the pretense of motherhood and disappeared to pursue her art in Paris, leaving behind 2 confused and heartbroken children, Alicia arrived like an answer to a prayer no one remembered praying. She came recommended by another family, her reputation built on a foundation of reliability, warmth, and an uncanny ability to transform chaos into calm. The Martinez mansion sprawled across 2 acres in the hills above Sunset Boulevard, its contemporary architecture, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city below. The interior design spoke of money spent carelessly, Italian marble floors that echoed with loneliness, abstract paintings that cost more than most people's houses, and furniture so pristine it seemed to warn against human touch. It was a monument to wealth that had forgotten its purpose, beautiful and cold as a mausoleum. From her first day, Alicia moved through these sterile spaces like a warm wind, bringing life to rooms that had known only silence. She hung Isabella's drawings on the refrigerator, despite the housekeeper's disapproving glance. She filled the playroom with the sound of lullabies sung in Spanish, her voice carrying melodies her own mother had hummed while scrubbing other people's floors. She turned the kitchen into a laboratory of love, baking cookies that filled the house with the smell of vanilla and cinnamon, teaching the children that food prepared with care tasted different from anything money could buy. But it was in the quiet moments that Alicia's true magic revealed itself. When Isabella woke from nightmares about her mother's departure, Alicia was there, stroking her hair and whispering that sometimes people leave not because we're unlovable, but because they're lost. When Matteo struggled with the terrible twos, throwing himself on the marble floor in spectacular tantrums, Alicia knelt beside him with infinite patience, holding space for his big feelings until they transformed into giggles and requests for hugs. Richard observed these interactions from a distance, when he observed them at all. Most days, he left for his downtown office before the children woke and returned after they'd fallen asleep, their bedtime stories another responsibility he'd delegated to the woman he paid to care. His relationship with wealth had always been complicated. It provided security and status, but it had also taught him to view everything through the lens of transaction. In his world, love was something you purchased through expensive gifts and private schools, not something that grew in the soil of daily presence and patient tending. The other staff members at the Martinez house treated Alicia with polite distance, recognizing her competence but never quite accepting her as an equal. Maria, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for 12 years, maintained strict hierarchies and reminded everyone, including Alicia, that they were employees first, human beings second. The groundskeeper spoke only broken English and kept to himself. The cook, a temperamental woman named Claire, who had trained at Le Cordon Bleu, viewed the kitchen as her domain and barely tolerated Alicia's cookie-baking sessions with the children. This isolation might have broken someone else, but Alicia had learned long ago that love doesn't require an audience to be real. She poured herself into Isabella and Matteo with the same devotion a river shows to its banks, shaping their days with countless small kindnesses that no one bothered to notice or appreciate. She taught Isabella to braid hair during lazy Sunday afternoons, their fingers working together as they talked about everything and nothing. She showed Matteo how to tie his shoes, celebrating each small victory as if he'd just learned to fly. The children, in return, loved her with the uncomplicated fierceness that only children possess. They ran to her when they were hurt, sought her approval for their drawings and achievements, and gradually began calling her Tia Alicia, Aunt Alicia, a title that meant more to her than any formal recognition ever could. Their love became her validation, their happiness her greatest achievement. But love given in silence often goes unseen by those who need to see it most. And the Martinez household continued to operate according to its established rhythms of emotional detachment and purchased affection. Richard's wealth continued to grow, his investment portfolio flourishing even as his connection to his children withered. While Alicia's bank account remained modestly stable, most of her modest salary sent home to support her aging parents in their senior years. The first crack in this carefully maintained distance appeared on a fog-shrouded Tuesday morning in November, when the ordinary rhythm of their lives was interrupted by an extraordinary moment of terror and grace. It was the kind of morning that starts like any other, but ends by changing everything. The kind of day that reveals who people truly are when pretense falls away like a discarded mask. Isabella had caught a stomach flu that was making its way through her expensive private school, leaving her pale and listless on the living room sofa. Alicia spent the morning moving between caring for the sick child and entertaining Matteo, who at 3 years old possessed the boundless energy of someone who had never known true fatigue. She prepared bland toast and ginger tea for Isabella, read stories in both English and Spanish, and somehow managed to keep Matteo occupied without waking his sleeping sister. By afternoon, Isabella was feeling well enough to nap peacefully, and Alicia decided to take Matteo outside to burn off some energy in the expansive backyard. The Martinez property included a playground that had cost more than most cars, imported from Germany and installed by specialists who had lectured Richard about safety features and developmental benefits. Yet for all its expensive components, nothing about that playground matched the simple joy of running through fallen leaves or chasing butterflies. Matteo had always been an adventurous child, the kind of boy who saw every fence as a suggestion rather than a boundary. While Alicia was gathering the toys they'd scattered across the lawn, he spotted a cat sitting just beyond the property's edge and decided to introduce himself. The gate, which should have been locked, had been left slightly ajar by the landscaping crew who had worked that morning. Later, Richard would remember this moment as the one that changed everything he thought he knew about the woman who cared for his children. He had arrived home early, unusual for him, intending to check on Isabella's flu and perhaps demonstrate the kind of parental concern that expensive private therapy had suggested he should show more often. Instead, he witnessed something that would reshape his understanding of love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family. Matteo had wandered perhaps 20 yards from the property, but in a neighborhood where wealthy residents valued privacy above pedestrian safety, 20 yards was far enough to put him directly in the path of a Mercedes sedan, whose driver was more focused on his Bluetooth call than the residential speed limit. The car was traveling at least 40 miles per hour when Alicia spotted Matteo crouched beside the cat, completely oblivious to the approaching danger. What happened next occurred in the space between heartbeats, that eternal instant where love reveals its true face and heroes are born from the ashes of ordinary moments. Alicia ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her worn athletic shoes finding purchase on the steep asphalt as she launched herself toward the child who had become more precious to her than her own safety. She reached Matteo just as the Mercedes driver finally looked up from his phone, his eyes widening in horror as he realized what was about to happen. The screech of brakes mixed with Alicia's grunt of effort as she scooped the boy into her arms and rolled them both toward the safety of the sidewalk. The car missed them by inches, close enough that Alicia could feel the heat from its engine and smell the rubber of its tires. Richard saw it all from the living room window, his heart stopping and restarting as he watched his son's life hang in the balance for what felt like hours, but lasted only seconds. By the time he reached the street, Alicia was sitting on the curb with Matteo cradled against her chest, both of them shaking but miraculously unharmed. The boy was crying, more from shock than injury, while Alicia murmured comfort in Spanish, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. The Mercedes driver had gotten out of his car, his face pale with the realization of what had almost happened. He was apologizing profusely, offering his insurance information, asking if anyone needed medical attention. But Richard barely heard him. His entire focus was on the woman who sat holding his son as if he were made of spun glass, her body still curved protectively around the child, even though the danger had passed. For the first time in 3 years, Richard truly saw Alicia, not as an employee or a convenient solution to his childcare needs, but as a human being who had just risked everything to save his son's life. The realization hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to acknowledge how completely he had failed to recognize the depth of her devotion and the magnitude of her sacrifice. That evening, after Matteo had been checked by their family doctor and pronounced perfectly healthy after Isabella had been told a carefully edited version of the day's events, after the house had settled into its usual quiet rhythms, Richard found himself standing outside Alicia's small room on the mansion's lower level. He raised his hand to knock, then paused, suddenly uncertain how to express gratitude for something that transcended any normal understanding of duty or employment. When he finally knocked, Alicia opened the door already dressed in her street clothes, her purse in her hand. She'd been planning to go home, to decompress from the day's trauma in the privacy of her own space, but she stopped when she saw Richard's expression. "I need to talk to you," he said, and something in his voice, a vulnerability she had never heard before, made her set down her purse and invite him into the small sitting area that served as her bedroom, living room, and sanctuary. They sat across from each other in the modest furniture the mansion's interior designer had selected for staff quarters, the distance between them representing more than physical space. Richard found himself struggling with words. A man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals, suddenly unable to articulate the simple truth of his gratitude. "Thank you," he finally managed, and the inadequacy of those two words hung between them like a bridge too small to bear the weight of what needed to be crossed. Alicia nodded, her hands folded in her lap, still wearing the scrape on her palm from where she had braced their fall. "He's a good boy," she said simply, as if risking her life for his son required no more explanation than commenting on the weather. "You could have been killed," Richard said, and there was something raw in his voice that made Alicia look at him more closely. For the first time, she saw past the expensive suit and the confident demeanor to the frightened father underneath, the man who had almost lost something irreplaceable and didn't quite know how to process the grief that might have been. "But we weren't," she replied, and in those 3 words Richard heard something he had forgotten existed, the quiet faith that holds families together, the unwavering belief that love will find a way to protect what matters most. They talked for nearly an hour that night, longer than they had ever spoken as employer and employee. Richard found himself asking questions he had never thought to ask before, about Alicia's family, her path to childcare, her dreams beyond the walls of his mansion. She answered with the same gentle honesty she brought to everything else, sharing pieces of herself that she had kept carefully guarded for 3 years. She told him about her parents, who had worked multiple jobs to send her to community college, where she had studied early childhood development before life intervened with different plans. She spoke of her siblings scattered across California, all of them carrying their parents' work ethic like DNA, all of them understanding that success meant not what you accumulated, but what you contributed. She mentioned, briefly and without self-pity, the son she had lost and how that loss had taught her to love other people's children with fierce protectiveness. Richard listened with the attention of someone hearing a language he had forgotten he understood. Her story was so different from his own, where his childhood had been cushioned by private schools and trust funds. Hers had been shaped by sacrifice and resilience. Yet in her voice, he heard something his wealth had never been able to purchase, the deep contentment that comes from knowing your purpose and living it fully. When their conversation finally ended, Richard walked back to his own bedroom with a strange feeling in his chest, as if something that had been frozen for years was beginning to thaw. For the first time since his wife's departure, he felt the stirring of something that might eventually become gratitude, not just for the day's heroics, but for the countless smaller acts of love that had kept his family intact while he focused on building his fortune. The days following the near accident brought subtle changes to the dynamics of the Martinez household. Richard began arriving home earlier, making an effort to spend time with his children before their bedtime. He noticed things that had been invisible to him before, the way Isabella's face lit up when Alicia praised her drawings, the comfort Mateo took from the Spanish lullabies that drifted from his room each night, the transformation that occurred in his sterile mansion whenever Alicia worked her quiet magic. He also began to notice the other staff members' treatment of Alicia, the way they relegated her to a lower status despite her education and obvious competence. During a staff meeting, he made subtle changes to the household hierarchy, ensuring that Alicia's opinions were heard and respected, that her insights into his children's needs were given the weight they deserved. But change, like love, often arrives in waves rather than steady streams, and the Martinez family was about to experience both the highest tide of connection and the devastating undertow that would threaten to wash away everything they had begun to build. The opportunity for deeper understanding came on a quiet Sunday evening in late December, when Los Angeles was experiencing one of its rare winter storms. Rain hammered against the mansion's windows, while wind bent the palm trees in the garden into impossible angles. Isabella had been battling insomnia, a common occurrence during times of stress or change, and Alicia had volunteered to sit with her until sleep finally arrived. Richard found them in Isabella's room, his 7-year-old daughter curled against Alicia's side, while the woman who cared for her spoke in gentle tones about anything and everything: school projects, favorite colors, dreams for the future, and fears that seemed smaller when shared with someone who truly listened. "Tia Alicia," Isabella said, her voice drowsy but curious, "how come you never had any kids of your own?" It was an innocent question, the kind children ask without understanding the landmines they might trigger. Richard froze in the doorway, suddenly aware that he was witnessing something private and precious, yet unable to make himself leave. Alicia was quiet for a long moment, her hand continuing to stroke Isabella's hair while she chose her words carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of honesty that only emerges in darkness, when defenses are down and truth feels safe. "I did have a baby once," she said softly. "A little boy, smaller than Matteo was when I first met him. But sometimes, even when we love someone with our whole heart, we can't make them stay." Isabella shifted against her side, processing this information with the serious consideration children bring to matters of the heart. "Were you very sad?" "Yes, mija. Sadder than I thought it was possible to be." "But then you found us," Isabella said, and there was something so matter-of-fact about her statement, such complete acceptance of the idea that love could transform and transcend loss, that Richard felt tears prick his eyes. "Yes," Alicia agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of Isabella's head, "then I found you." "And we found you too," Isabella murmured, and within minutes she was asleep, her breathing deep and peaceful in the way that only comes when children feel completely safe. Richard slipped away before Alicia noticed his presence, but her words echoed in his mind for hours afterward. He lay awake in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling while rain continued to pound against his windows, and for the first time in years he thought about loss, not financial loss, which he understood intimately, but the kind of loss that rearranges your soul and teaches you what truly matters. He thought about his own son, whose tiny life had lasted only 3 days, and he wondered if anyone had ever held that boy with the kind of tenderness Alicia showed his children. He thought about his ex-wife, who had left not because she didn't love them, but because she couldn't figure out how to love them enough. And he thought about Alicia, who had taken her greatest sorrow and transformed it into her greatest strength, becoming a mother to children who needed her exactly as much as she needed them. The next morning brought an unusual sight in the Martinez household. Richard sitting at the kitchen table, sharing breakfast with his children, instead of rushing off to his office with coffee and emails. He watched Alicia move around the kitchen, preparing Isabella's favorite French toast and cutting Matteo's food into manageable pieces, and he saw her differently now. Not as an employee fulfilling contracted duties, but as a woman who had chosen to pour her wounded heart into healing others. "Alicia," he said as she refilled his coffee cup, and there was something different in his tone, something that made her pause and look at him directly. "I want you to know how grateful I am. Not just for yesterday, but for everything, for the way you love them." She nodded, a slight flush coloring her cheeks, unused to such direct acknowledgement from the man who signed her paychecks. "They make it easy," she replied, but they both knew it wasn't true. Love was never easy, only necessary. For several weeks, this new understanding seemed to settle over the household like a warm blanket. Richard made more effort to be present, Alicia felt more valued and seen, and the children basked in the attention from both the adults who cared for them. It felt, for a brief and shining moment, like they might actually become the family they had been pretending to be all along. But happiness, Alicia had learned long ago, was not a destination, but a temporary resting place. And the universe had not finished testing the strength of the bonds they had begun to forge. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source. Claire, the cook whose culinary expertise had always been her primary claim to authority in the household hierarchy. She had been watching the growing closeness between Richard and Alicia with increasing resentment, interpreting their connection as a threat to her own position and status. Claire had worked for wealthy families throughout Beverly Hills for 15 years, and she understood the unspoken rules that governed relationships between employers and staff. Boundaries existed for good reasons, she believed, and Alicia's increasing influence over the family dynamics represented a dangerous precedent that could only lead to trouble. Her opportunity to act came during a dinner party Richard hosted for potential investors in his latest venture, a sustainable technology startup that promised to revolutionize renewable energy storage. The guest list included several prominent venture capitalists, a couple of celebrities who had become serious investors in green technology, and Richard's business partner, a sharp-eyed woman named Sandra, who had built her own fortune through a combination of strategic investments and ruthless efficiency. Alicia wasn't supposed to be visible during the dinner party. Her role was to keep the children quiet and out of sight while the adults conducted their business. But Mateo had developed a fever that afternoon, the kind of sudden illness that transforms cheerful 3-year-olds into miserable, clingy shadows of themselves. She had tried everything in her arsenal of comfort techniques, cool washcloths, gentle songs, favorite stuffed animals, but nothing seemed to soothe him. His temperature had risen to 101 degrees, high enough to warrant concern, but not high enough to justify an emergency room visit. What he needed most was the steady presence of someone who loved him unconditionally, and Alicia was prepared to provide exactly that. The problem arose when Mateo's cries grew loud enough to disturb the dinner party conversation. Richard, caught between his parental concern and his professional obligations, found himself torn between two worlds that suddenly seemed incompatible. Claire saw her opportunity and seized it with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. "Mr. Martinez," she said, appearing in the dining room doorway with perfectly timed urgency. "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation with the nanny that requires your immediate attention." She had chosen her words carefully, using Alicia's professional title rather than her name, emphasizing the employment relationship rather than the personal bond. The dinner guests looked up with the polite interest of people who understood that children and their caretakers sometimes created inconveniences that required adult intervention. Richard excused himself and followed Claire to the kitchen, where she proceeded to paint a picture of Alicia as someone who had overstepped her boundaries, who had become too emotionally involved with the children, who was now disrupting important business because she couldn't maintain appropriate professional distance. "She's upstairs refusing to let anyone else help with Mateo," Claire reported with just the right combination of concern and disapproval. "She says she knows what's best for him, that no one else can comfort him properly. It's not healthy, Mr. Martinez, this level of attachment." The accusations fell on fertile ground because Richard's newfound appreciation for Alicia had been complicated by his own discomfort with emotional intimacy. Part of him recognized that Claire's concerns played into his deepest fears about relationships, about the dangerous territory between professional and personal, about the vulnerability that came with letting someone matter too much. He climbed the stairs to Mateo's room, where he found Alicia sitting in the rocking chair by the window. His son curled against her chest while she hummed soft melodies in Spanish. Mateo's fever had broken, and he was sleeping peacefully for the first time all day, his small fist curled around a strand of Alicia's hair. "His temperature's down to 99, she whispered when Richard appeared in the doorway. "I think he's going to be fine, but I wanted to make sure he stays comfortable through the night." Richard looked at this scene, his son safe and peaceful in the arms of a woman who had spent her entire day focused on his comfort and healing, and felt something that might have been gratitude if it hadn't been tangled up with Claire's insinuations and his own complicated feelings about dependency and attachment. "I can take it from here," he said, and there was something different in his voice. Something that made Alicia look up at him with sudden wariness. "He's finally sleeping," she said carefully. "If we move him now—" "I said I can handle it," Richard repeated, and this time his tone left no room for negotiation. Alicia carefully transferred Mateo to his father's arms, the boy stirring slightly but remaining asleep. As she gathered her things to leave the room, Richard found himself struggling with emotions he couldn't quite name. Appreciation mixed with resentment, gratitude complicated by fear, love overshadowed by the terror of being vulnerable to someone whose own needs he didn't understand. "Alicia," he called as she reached the door, and when she turned back to him, he saw something in her eyes that he would remember later with regret. Complete trust. The expectation that whatever he was about to say would be kind and fair and worthy of the relationship they had been building. "Maybe Claire is right," he said, and the words felt like betrayal even as they left his mouth. "Maybe you're getting too involved." The hurt that flashed across Alicia's face was quickly concealed, but not quickly enough for Richard to miss it. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that spoke of wounds he didn't fully understand, and left the room without another word. That night, after his guests had gone home and his children were sleeping peacefully, Richard lay awake feeling like he had made a terrible mistake, but unable to identify exactly what it was or how to fix it. Claire's concerns had seemed reasonable when she presented them, but now they felt like echoes of his own fears rather than legitimate observations about Alicia's behavior. The damage, however, had been done. Claire had planted seeds of doubt that would grow in the weeks to come, fed by Richard's own ambivalence about emotional intimacy and his learned distrust of relationships that couldn't be controlled through contracts and clear expectations. Alicia, for her part, began to pull back from the casual intimacy that had developed between her and the Martinez family. She continued to care for the children with the same devotion, but she was more careful now about boundaries, more conscious of her role as employee rather than family member. The spontaneous conversations with Richard stopped, replaced by polite updates about the children's schedules and needs. The children, sensitive to changes in emotional weather the way animals sense approaching storms, began to act out in small ways. Isabella grew clingy and anxious, while Mateo developed a pattern of tantrums that seemed designed to force the adults in his life to pay attention to him. The household, which had briefly felt like a home, returned to its previous state of elegant dysfunction. But the universe, as Alicia's mother had always said, has a way of revealing truth even when we try to hide from it. The final test of their fragile bonds was approaching, and when it arrived, it would strip away all pretense and force everyone to confront who they really were and what they truly valued. The crisis began on a Thursday morning in early March, when Los Angeles was experiencing one of those perfect spring days that reminded everyone why people tolerated the traffic, the expense, and the occasional earthquake to live in Southern California. The air was crisp and clear, the mountains visible in stunning detail, and even the notorious smog seemed to have taken the day off. Alicia arrived at work to find the household in its usual morning chaos. Isabella searching for a missing homework assignment, Mateo refusing to eat anything that wasn't served in his favorite dinosaur bowl, and Richard preparing for a crucial presentation to potential investors who were flying in from Tokyo. The presentation represented months of work and millions of dollars in potential investment for Richard's renewable energy company. His personal net worth was solid enough to weather any business setback, but this particular project represented more than money. It was his attempt to create a legacy beyond wealth accumulation, to contribute something meaningful to the world his children would inherit. He left that morning with barely a word to anyone, his mind already focused on spreadsheets and projected returns, completely unaware that this would be the day everything changed. Alicia settled into her usual routine, getting the children ready for school and managing the 1,000 small details that kept their lives running smoothly. Isabella's teacher had requested a conference about her recent anxiety and difficulty concentrating, while Mateo was scheduled for his 3-year wellness check with their pediatrician. It was the kind of ordinary day that would have passed without comment if not for the phone call that came just after lunch. Maria, the housekeeper, took the call in her halting English, her face growing pale as she listened to the rapid Spanish on the other end. When she hung up, she turned to Alicia with tears in her eyes. Es su madre, she said quietly. Your mother. She's in the hospital. The details came in fragments over the next few minutes. Alicia's mother had collapsed at the senior center where she volunteered 3 days a week, teaching English to newly arrived immigrants. A stroke, the doctors thought, though they were still running tests. She was conscious but confused, asking for her daughter in the few moments when she seemed to recognize where she was. Alicia stood in the Martinez kitchen, her hands shaking as she processed this information. Her mother had been the steady center of their family, the woman who had worked double shifts to keep them fed and housed, who had insisted on education even when money was scarce, who had taught them that dignity came from how you treated others rather than what others thought of you. You have to go, Maria said, recognizing the conflict playing out across Alicia's face. But it wasn't that simple. Richard was in the most important meeting of his professional life. The children were her responsibility, and leaving without permission could cost her the job she needed to pay for her mother's medical care. She called Richard's office, but his assistant informed her that he was in meetings all day and had given strict instructions not to be disturbed except for emergencies. The assistant, trained to gatekeep and prioritize, didn't consider an employee's family crisis sufficient reason to interrupt multi-million-dollar negotiations. Alicia tried his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail, turned off for the presentation. She left a message explaining the situation, but she had no idea when he might receive it or how he might respond. Time was slipping away, measured in heartbeats and worry. Every minute she delayed was a minute she couldn't spend holding her mother's hand, being present for the woman who had always been present for her. The weight of duty warred with the pull of devotion, and for once, devotion won. She made arrangements for the children. Isabella could stay after school for extended care, and Maria promised to collect Mateo from his doctor's appointment. She left detailed notes about medications, preferences, and routines, then caught the first available bus toward downtown Los Angeles and the county hospital where her mother lay surrounded by machines and uncertainty. Richard returned home at 7 o'clock that evening, flush with success from a presentation that had exceeded his wildest expectations. The Japanese investors had committed to funding his renewable energy project at a level that would transform not just his company, but potentially the entire clean technology sector. His personal fortune had just increased by tens of millions of dollars. His business reputation was secure for years to come, and he felt the particular satisfaction that came from achieving something that mattered beyond mere profit. His euphoria lasted exactly as long as it took him to discover that Alicia was gone. Maria tried to explain the situation, but her English failed her under pressure, and Richard's Spanish had never progressed beyond ordering restaurants and communicating with gardeners. The message was clear enough, though. Family emergency, hospital, had to leave. And Richard's first emotion wasn't sympathy or understanding, but anger. How dare she leave without permission? How dare she prioritize her own needs over his family's requirements? How dare she abandon her responsibilities on the same day he had explicitly told his assistant to hold all calls? Claire, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, appeared at his elbow like a helpful demon. "This is exactly what I was worried about," she said with perfectly calibrated concern. "The inappropriate level of attachment, the boundary issues. Professional nannies don't just abandon their positions because of personal problems." Richard found himself nodding, his anger building as Claire painted Alicia's emergency departure as evidence of unprofessional behavior rather than human crisis. His children were confused and slightly frightened by the disruption to their routine. Dinner was late, and his celebration was completely ruined by having to deal with childcare logistics on what should have been the best day of his professional life. By bedtime, he'd convinced himself that Alicia's departure represented a fundamental betrayal of trust. She had signed a contract, accepted responsibilities, and then abandoned them without proper notice or authorization. The fact that she was dealing with a family medical emergency seemed less important than the principle of professional reliability. He went to bed that night, having made a decision that felt righteous in his anger, but would haunt him for months to come. In the morning, he would terminate Alicia's employment. He had built his fortune on the principle that business was business, that personal feelings couldn't be allowed to interfere with professional standards, that clear boundaries and consequences were essential for maintaining order. What he didn't know, what he wouldn't learn for another year, was that Alicia spent that night holding her mother's hand, while machines monitored vital signs and nurses moved quietly through hallways that smelled of disinfectant and hope. Her mother had awakened at midnight, confused and frightened, calling for her daughter in Spanish that grew more frantic, until Alicia's voice calmed her back to peaceful sleep. "Mija," her mother had whispered in one of her clearer moments, "did I teach you bien? Did I teach you to love?" And Alicia, tears streaming down her face, had answered, "Sí, Mama, you taught me everything." Her mother died at dawn, peacefully, with her daughter's voice singing the same lullabies Alicia had later shared with Isabella and Mateo, the songs that connected generations through melody and memory. By the time Richard was composing his termination letter, Alicia was making funeral arrangements and wondering how she would find the strength to continue breathing in a world without her mother's laughter. The letter was waiting for her when she returned to the Martinez mansion 3 days later. Exhausted from grief and funeral planning, but desperate to return to the children who needed her and the work that provided her only source of income. She had left 17 voicemails for Richard, each one explaining her situation in greater detail, but he had never called her back. The letter was brief, professional, and devastating. Effective immediately, her services were no longer required. Her final paycheck would be direct deposited, and all benefits would terminate at the end of the month. The reasons given were failure to provide adequate notice of absence and abandonment of contractual responsibilities. There was no acknowledgement of her 3 years of devoted service, no recognition of the love she had poured into his children, no understanding that she had chosen between impossible loyalties and made the only choice her heart would allow. She was being discarded like a malfunctioning appliance, replaced before her absence could create any lasting inconvenience. Alicia read the letter twice, standing in the marble foyer where she had greeted countless mornings with hope and purpose. The house felt different already, colder, more sterile, as if her departure had restored its original museum-like quality. She could hear Isabella and Mateo playing somewhere upstairs, their voices a reminder of everything she was losing through no fault of her own. Maria appeared at her elbow, her face etched with sympathy and helplessness. "Lo siento," she whispered. "I'm sorry." But there was nothing she could do. Her own position was precarious enough without interfering in decisions made by the man who signed all their checks. Alicia climbed the stairs one last time, hoping to say goodbye to the children who had become her heart's delight, but Claire intercepted her before she reached their rooms. "Mr. Martinez's instructions were very clear," the cook said with satisfaction, barely concealed his concern. "A clean break is better for everyone involved." So Alicia left the way she had never imagined leaving, silently, invisibly, carrying only her purse and the weight of injustice. The children would ask about her, she knew, but they would be told that sometimes people go away and don't come back, that life continues and hearts heal, and love can be replaced through sufficient time and distraction. She took the bus back to East Los Angeles with tears streaming down her face, not just for her own loss, but for Isabella and Mateo, who would wake tomorrow to find that another adult they trusted had disappeared from their lives without explanation or goodbye. She thought about trust and how easily it could be broken, about love and how carelessly it could be discarded, about the invisible threads that bind families together and how quickly they could be severed by fear and misunderstanding. The apartment she returned to felt smaller than she remembered, emptied not just by her mother's death, but by the absence of purpose that had given her life meaning for 3 years. She sat on her narrow couch, surrounded by the few belongings that comprised her entire material world, and wondered how someone could love so deeply and still be considered so replaceable. But grief, as Alicia's mother had taught her, was not the end of the story. It was the compost from which new growth eventually emerged. And although she couldn't see it yet, the seeds of justice were already beginning to sprout in the rich soil of her suffering. The Martinez household, meanwhile, began its slow descent from functional family unit to elegant chaos. Richard hired a replacement nanny within a week, a professionally trained woman with impeccable references who understood boundaries and maintained appropriate emotional distance from her young charges. She was efficient, punctual, and completely incapable of providing the warmth and intuitive care that had made Alicia irreplaceable. Isabella began having nightmares again, waking up calling for Tia Alicia and becoming inconsolable when told that her beloved caretaker was gone. Mateo, too young to understand the concept of permanent departure, spent hours waiting by the front door for Alicia to return, his little face pressed against the glass as he watched for her familiar figure walking up the circular drive. Richard, busy expanding his renewable energy empire and managing the influx of Japanese investment capital, attributed the children's behavioral changes to normal adjustment difficulties. Children were resilient, the new nanny assured him, and consistency would eventually restore order to their emotional lives. He increased therapy sessions, purchased additional toys and activities, and assumed that time and professional intervention would resolve whatever lingering attachment issues his children were experiencing. But money, as he was slowly beginning to learn, couldn't purchase the specific kind of love his children had lost when Alicia walked out of their lives. The new nanny fed them nutritious meals and maintained their schedules, but she didn't sing Spanish lullabies or celebrate tiny victories with enthusiastic pride. She supervised their activities without joining them, maintained their safety without understanding their hearts. Months passed, and the household settled into its new routine of expensive efficiency and emotional emptiness. Richard's business continued to flourish. His renewable energy company received additional rounds of funding. His personal investments in Bitcoin and traditional stocks performed better than projected, and his net worth approached figures that would have seemed impossible when he first started his entrepreneurial career. Yet, something nagged at him during quiet moments, a sense of loss that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the quality of silence in his house. The children were well cared for, but they seemed dimmer somehow, their laughter less spontaneous, their joy more tentative. Isabella's grades suffered slightly, while Mateo developed a stubborn streak that no amount of professional childcare expertise seemed able to address. It was Isabella who finally forced him to confront what he had lost when he chose to prioritize professional standards over human understanding. She was 8 years old now, articulate enough to express complex emotions, but young enough to believe that honest communication could solve any problem. "Daddy," she said one evening as he was tucking her into bed, "why did Tia Alicia have to go away?" He had prepared for this question, developed an age-appropriate explanation about how sometimes people's jobs end and they have to find new work. But when he looked into his daughter's eyes, he saw something that stopped his rehearsed speech before it could begin, the same look he remembered from his own childhood when adults had lied to him about things that mattered. "Her mother was sick," he said finally, and it was partly true, though not the whole truth. "But we could have helped," Isabella said with the logic of a child who believed that love solved problems. "We have lots of money. We could have paid for the doctors." Richard felt something twist in his chest, a recognition that his 8-year-old daughter understood something about family loyalty that had escaped him entirely. "It's more complicated than that, sweetheart." "She loved us," Isabella continued, and there was something fierce in her voice, something that reminded him uncomfortably of his own determination when he believed in something strongly. "She loved us like we were her real kids, and we loved her back. That should count for something, shouldn't it?" He kissed her forehead and turned out the light, but her words echoed in his mind long after she fell asleep. In his daughter's simple statement, he heard an indictment of his own emotional cowardice, his willingness to sacrifice relationship for the safety of professional distance. That night, unable to sleep, Richard found himself in his home office, staring at the financial reports that usually provided him with comfort and purpose. His renewable energy company was thriving. His investment portfolio had never been stronger, and his accountants projected continued growth across all his revenue streams. By any measurable standard, he was more successful than he had ever been. Yet, he felt hollow, as if success had carved out space inside him without filling it with anything meaningful. He thought about Isabella's question. That should count for something, shouldn't it? And realized that for 3 years he had taken for granted the very thing his money couldn't buy: unconditional love freely given. He began to remember moments he had witnessed but never fully appreciated. Alicia staying awake all night when Matteo had a high fever, refusing to sleep until his temperature returned to normal. The way she had celebrated Isabella's first successful bike ride as if it were an Olympic victory. The countless small acts of tenderness that had held his family together while he focused on building his fortune. And he remembered the letter he had written, cold and professional, reducing 3 years of devoted service to a contract violation that warranted immediate termination. He had never even asked about her mother, never wondered if she was okay, never offered the kind of support that any decent human being would provide to someone experiencing a family crisis. The guilt, when it finally arrived, was overwhelming. He spent the next morning trying to track down Alicia's current contact information, but she seemed to have vanished from the carefully networked world of Beverly Hills domestic workers. The employment agency that had originally recommended her reported that she was no longer seeking nanny positions. Her old phone number had been disconnected, and the address on file from her employment application led to an apartment building where the current residents had never heard of her. Richard hired a private investigator, telling himself it was for practical reasons. He needed to provide proper references, ensure she had received her final paycheck, tie up loose ends that had been overlooked in his haste to terminate her employment. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. He needed to apologize, to acknowledge the magnitude of his mistake, to attempt restitution for an injury that went far beyond mere employment issues. The investigation took weeks, but eventually the trail led back to East Los Angeles, to the community where Alicia had grown up and the people who had known her long before she ever set foot in the Martinez mansion. What Richard discovered there changed his understanding not just of the woman who had cared for his children, but of the entire world that existed beyond his privileged bubble. Alicia hadn't disappeared. She had simply returned home to a neighborhood where people looked out for each other, and love was measured in presence rather than presence. She was working at a community center, teaching English to recent immigrants and helping them navigate the complex systems of healthcare, education, and employment that could seem so overwhelming to families trying to build new lives in an unfamiliar country. The children she worked with adored her with the same devotion Isabella and Matteo had shown, drawn to her combination of firm guidance and infinite patience. She had channeled her grief over losing both her mother and her surrogate family into service to others, transforming pain into purpose in the way that only the strongest hearts can manage. When Richard finally found the courage to visit her workplace, he felt like an alien landing on a foreign planet. The community center was a converted warehouse in a neighborhood where Spanish was the primary language, and murals covered walls that would have been considered valuable real estate in his world. The building buzzed with activity: children doing homework, older adults attending citizenship classes, families sharing meals and stories, and the kind of casual intimacy that his wealth had never been able to purchase. He found Alicia in a classroom, helping a group of women practice English phrases they would need for job interviews. She looked older, he thought, and there was a stillness about her that hadn't been there before, as if grief had settled into her bones and become part of her foundation rather than something she carried. When she saw him standing in the doorway, her face remained perfectly composed, but he caught the smallest tightening around her eyes, the subtle defensive posture of someone who had learned not to trust appearances of friendship from people who had the power to hurt her. "Mr. Martinez," she said politely, and the formal address hit him like a slap, reminding him of the distance they had returned to after those brief months of something approaching closeness. Could we talk?" he asked, and something in his voice, uncertainty maybe, or genuine remorse, made her nod and excuse herself from her students. They walked to a small courtyard behind the building, where children's artwork decorated walls and garden boxes grew vegetables that would supplement family meals. It was the kind of space that had been created through volunteer labor and donated materials, beautiful in its imperfection and rich with the evidence of community love. "How are the children?" Alicia asked first, because her heart still belonged to them, even though her employment did not. "They miss you," Richard admitted, and the simple honesty of that statement opened something between them that formal politeness had tried to keep closed. "Isabella asks about you constantly. Matteo still waits by the door sometimes, watching for you to come home." The pain that flashed across Alicia's face was quickly controlled, but not quickly enough for Richard to miss. She had loved those children completely, and losing them had carved a wound that might never fully heal. "They're strong," she said quietly. "Children adapt." "But they shouldn't have to," Richard replied, and there was something different in his voice now, something that made Alicia look at him more carefully. They shouldn't have to lose someone they love because their father was too stupid and scared to understand what really mattered. The apology, when it came, was comprehensive and devastating. Richard told her about the private investigator, about the months of searching, about the guilt that had eaten at him since the day he wrote that terrible letter. He spoke about his own fears of emotional attachment, his learned distrust of relationships that couldn't be controlled through contracts and clear expectations. He told her about Isabella's questions and Matteo's loyalty, about the way the house felt empty despite being filled with expensive furniture and professional child care. He acknowledged that he had failed not just as an employer, but as a human being, letting fear override compassion when she needed support most. "Your mother," he said at the end, and his voice broke slightly. "I'm so sorry about your mother. I should have been there. I should have helped." Alicia listened to all of this with the same patience she had shown his children when they struggled to express complex emotions. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, watching a group of children play soccer in the courtyard while she chose her words carefully. "She would have liked you," she said finally. "My mother. She always said that people aren't good or bad, just scared or brave, and scared people do things they wouldn't do if they felt safe." It was forgiveness, but not the kind he had expected, not absolution that erased his mistakes, but understanding that acknowledged his humanity even as it held him accountable for his choices. "The children," he said. Could you see them, just once? I think they need to know you're okay." Alicia was quiet for so long that Richard began to think she would refuse. The idea of seeing Isabella and Matteo again would reopen wounds she had worked hard to heal, force her to confront the depth of her loss all over again. But love, as she had learned from her mother, was stronger than self-protection. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that very much." The reunion was arranged for the following Saturday at a neutral location, the park where Alicia used to take the children when they needed fresh air and open spaces. Richard brought them early, spending the walking time preparing them for seeing someone they had missed desperately, but learning they couldn't simply return to the way things were before. Isabella spotted Alicia first, her small body going completely still for a heartbeat before launching into a run that covered the distance between them faster than seemed physically possible. She threw herself into Alicia's arms with the kind of desperate hug that spoke of months of stored-up love and loss. Matteo, now 4 and more cautious, hung back at first as if testing whether this reunion was real or just another cruel disappointment. But when Alicia knelt down and opened her other arm, speaking his name in the gentle tone he remembered from countless bedtimes and scraped knees, he too dissolved into tears and embraces. Richard watched from a distance, giving them space for a reunion that belonged to them rather than him. What he witnessed was a master class in unconditional love, the way Alicia held them as if she could pour months of missed affection into a single moment, the way she listened to their flood of stories and questions with complete attention, the way she made them feel seen and valued and cherished just by being present. When the initial emotional storm had passed, they spread a blanket under a tree and shared the kind of easy conversation that had once been their daily rhythm. Isabella showed off new skills she had learned at school, while Matteo demonstrated his improved vocabulary and his ability to climb playground equipment that had once seemed impossibly tall. "Are you happy?" Isabella asked at one point, her 8-year-old intuition picking up on the changes in Alicia's demeanor. "I'm learning to be," Alicia replied honestly. "Sometimes happiness takes work, like learning to ride a bicycle. You have to practice balance." As the afternoon progressed, Richard noticed something remarkable happening. His children, who had seemed dimmed and cautious for months, began to shine again in Alicia's presence. Their laughter grew more spontaneous, their movements more confident. It was as if her love had watered drought-stricken ground, bringing color back to flowers that had been wilting without proper care. When it was time to leave, the goodbyes were tearful, but different from the abrupt separation that had marked her departure from their lives. This time, there were promises to stay in touch, plans for future visits, and the comfort of knowing that love could survive even when geography and circumstances made regular contact impossible. As they walked back to his car, Isabella slipped her hand into her father's and looked up at him with serious 8-year-old eyes. "She taught us that family isn't just people who live in the same house," she said. "Family is people who love you even when they can't see you every day." Richard squeezed her hand, recognizing wisdom that had taken him 43 years to understand. But understanding and action, as Richard was learning, were two different things entirely. Over the following weeks, he found himself haunted by the contrast between his children's joy during their visit with Alicia and their subdued behavior when they returned home. The new nanny was competent and professional, but she was a pale substitute for the woman who had loved them, not because it was her job, but because her heart had chosen them as its own. He began to realize that his attempts to fix the situation through increased therapy sessions and expensive activities were addressing symptoms rather than the core problem. Isabella and Matteo weren't struggling with adjustment disorder or attachment issues. They were grieving the loss of someone who had been fundamental to their sense of security and belonging. One evening, as he was reviewing financial reports in his home office, Richard made a decision that surprised even him. He closed his laptop, walked upstairs to the children's rooms, and asked them a question he had never thought to ask before. "What would make you happy?" he said to Isabella, who was struggling with homework that should have been manageable for a gifted 8-year-old. She looked at him with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust that her desires would be taken seriously. "Really happy? Or just a little bit happy?" The distinction broke his heart. "Really happy. I want Tia Alicia to come home," she said without hesitation. "I want our family to be together again." He asked Matteo the same question, crouching down beside the 4-year-old who was building elaborate structures with blocks, only to knock them down in apparent frustration. "Tia," Matteo said simply, as if the answer were so obvious that asking the question was unnecessary. That night, Richard lay awake thinking about family and loyalty, and the difference between love that could be purchased and love that could only be earned through consistent presence and care. His wealth had given him the power to control most aspects of his life, but it was useless in the face of his children's deepest need, to be reunited with the woman who had taught them what unconditional love looked like. He spent the next morning making phone calls, rearranging meetings, and clearing his schedule for what might be the most important negotiation of his professional life. But instead of boardrooms and investment portfolios, this negotiation would take place in a community center in East Los Angeles, and the stakes would be measured in hugs and bedtime stories rather than dollars and market share. When he arrived at the community center for the second time, Richard found Alicia in the same classroom, working with the same group of adult learners who were preparing for citizenship exams. He waited until their session ended, then approached her with the kind of nervousness he hadn't felt since his first business presentation decades earlier. "I need to ask you something," he said. and I need you to hear the whole question before you answer." Alicia nodded, her face showing the patient attention she gave to everyone who sought her help. "I want you to come back," Richard said, "not as an employee this time, but as family. I want to offer you something that's never been tested before, something that doesn't fit neatly into contracts or employment law." He had prepared for this conversation, but the words still came out more awkwardly than he had hoped. He told her about his realization that his children needed her in their lives permanently, not as hired help, but as chosen family. He spoke about his own growth, his understanding that love and loyalty were more valuable than professional boundaries and emotional distance. "I can't offer you a job," he said, "because what Isabella and Matteo need from you can't be reduced to employment terms. But I can offer you a home, a place in our family that can't be terminated or canceled or disrupted by my fears or anyone else's jealousy." The offer he outlined was unprecedented in his experience, but felt completely right in his heart. He wanted to provide Alicia with financial security for the rest of her life, not as payment for services, but as family support, the kind of mutual care that exists between people who have chosen to interweave their destinies. He spoke of college funds for any children she might have in the future, medical care, retirement planning, and a legal agreement that would protect her right to remain part of their family regardless of changing circumstances. "Think of it as an adoption that works in reverse," he said with a slight smile. "Instead of taking you into our legal family, I want to write you into our hearts in a way that can't be erased." Alicia listened to this extraordinary proposal with her characteristic composure, but Richard could see tears gathering in her eyes. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for so long that he began to worry she would refuse. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why now, after everything that happened?" Richard took a deep breath, knowing that his answer would determine whether she trusted him enough to risk being hurt again. "Because my children taught me something I should have learned years ago," he said. "They taught me that love isn't something you control or manage or limit through contracts and boundaries. Love is something you honor, protect, and nurture when you're lucky enough to find it." He paused, gathering courage for the most vulnerable admission of his life. "And because I've learned that money can buy almost anything except the things that matter most. It can't buy the sound of contentment in my children's laughter. It can't buy the peace that comes from knowing someone loves them completely. It can't buy back the trust I broke when I chose fear over faith." Alicia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that reminded him of countless moments when she had comforted his children through their own tears. "What about the other staff?" she asked practically. "What about people who think I'm overstepping boundaries again?" "There won't be other staff like that," Richard replied firmly. "Claire was terminated 2 months ago. Maria understands that you're family, not competition. And anyone we hire in the future will understand from the beginning that you're not an employee. You're part of us." The commitment he was making felt both terrifying and absolutely right. He was offering to restructure his entire household around the acknowledgement that Alicia's place in their lives couldn't be defined by traditional employer-employee relationships. "The children," Alicia said softly. "Do they know you're here?" "They know I'm trying to bring you home," Richard admitted. "They've been helping me plan how to make this work. Isabella has ideas about how to rearrange bedrooms. Matteo drew you a picture of our family that includes you right in the center." At this, Alicia's composure finally broke. She cried quietly, tears that seemed to carry months of suppressed grief and hope. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want to come home." The practical details of Alicia's return took several weeks to arrange, but the emotional reunion happened immediately. Richard called the children from the community center, putting Alicia on speakerphone so they could hear her voice promising to return to them permanently. The legal agreements that formalized their new relationship were unlike anything Richard's lawyers had ever drafted. They created a document that was part adoption papers, part family constitution, and part mutual protection treaty. Alicia would have full authority to make decisions regarding the children's daily care, education, and emotional well-being. She would have financial security regardless of changing family circumstances. Most importantly, she would have legal standing as family, with rights that couldn't be terminated by fear or misunderstanding. When Alicia finally walked through the front door of the Martinez mansion for the first time in over a year, she was greeted by children who had grown taller, but whose hugs felt exactly the same. The house itself seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath during her absence and could finally relax into its true purpose as a home rather than merely an expensive residence. Richard watched his children cling to Alicia with years of missed affection pouring out in an instant, and he understood that he was witnessing something his money could never have purchased, the reunion of a family that had been torn apart by fear but healed by courage and love. That evening, as they shared their first family dinner in over a year, Richard looked around the table at the faces that made up his true wealth. Isabella was explaining her latest art project with animated gestures, while Mateo insisted on sitting as close to Alicia as possible without climbing into her lap. Alicia listened to both children with the complete attention that had always been her gift, asking questions that showed she valued their thoughts and experiences. "Daddy," Isabella said at one point, "is Tia Alicia going to stay forever now?" Richard looked at Alicia, who nodded with a smile that held both promise and peace. "Forever," he confirmed. "She's not going anywhere, and neither are we." Later that night, after the children had been tucked into bed with extra stories and songs, Richard and Alicia sat in the living room that had once felt like a museum, but now hummed with the warmth of genuine family life. "Thank you," Richard said quietly, "for giving us another chance, for choosing to forgive me when I didn't deserve it." Alicia smiled, the kind of smile that held wisdom earned through suffering and joy reclaimed through love. "My mother used to say that families aren't born, they're built," she replied. "We built something good together, even when we didn't know what we were doing. Now, we get to rebuild it stronger." As the months passed, the Martinez household settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and entirely new. Alicia's presence transformed not just the children's daily experience, but the entire emotional climate of their home. Laughter returned spontaneously, bedtime became a celebration rather than a chore, and even routine activities like homework and chores were infused with the kind of patient guidance that helped children feel capable rather than criticized. Richard found himself learning as much as his children, discovering that genuine family life required presence rather than presence, attention rather than achievements. His business continued to thrive. The renewable energy company had expanded internationally, and his personal investments had reached levels that ensured generational wealth. But success felt different now, meaningful rather than merely measurable. He established the Alicia Rodriguez Foundation, dedicated to supporting families who needed help navigating medical crises, educational challenges, and the complex systems that could overwhelm people who lacked resources or connections. The foundation's first project was a scholarship program for immigrant children in East Los Angeles, administered through the community center where Alicia had worked during their separation. On the first anniversary of Alicia's return, the Martinez family celebrated with a quiet dinner at home, followed by a visit to the cemetery where Alicia's mother was buried. They brought flowers and stories, sharing memories of a woman none of them except Alicia had known, but who had shaped their lives through her daughter's love. "She would be proud," Richard said as they stood beside the grave marker. "She raised someone who taught us how to be a family." Isabella, now 9 and wise beyond her years, placed her small hand in Alicia's. "She's not really gone," she said with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to life's deepest truths. "She's in all the love you learned from her. And now that love is in us too." As they walked back to the car, Mateo skipping ahead while Isabella and Alicia discussed plans for the weekend, Richard reflected on the year that had transformed his understanding of wealth, success, and family. He had learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased, controlled, or managed through contracts and professional boundaries. Love, he now understood, was something you received by giving it freely, something you kept by sharing it generously, something you multiplied by refusing to hoard it jealously. The Martinez family had become living proof that the strongest bonds aren't forged through biology or legal documents, but through the daily choice to show up for each other with patience, presence, and unconditional acceptance. 6 months later, Richard received a call that would provide the final test of their reconstructed family bonds. A major investment opportunity had emerged, a chance to expand his renewable energy empire into European markets through a partnership that would require relocating to London for at least 2 years, possibly longer. The financial opportunity was extraordinary, potentially doubling his net worth and establishing him as a global leader in clean technology. The professional recognition would cement his reputation for decades. It was exactly the kind of opportunity he would have pursued without question just 2 years earlier. But now, as he discussed the possibility with Alicia and the children, different factors weighed more heavily in his decision-making process. "We go together, or we don't go at all," he said firmly. "This family doesn't get separated again." Alicia's eyes filled with tears at this declaration, recognizing how completely Richard had internalized the lesson that relationships matter more than achievements. "London," Isabella said thoughtfully. "Do they have good schools there?" "And parks?" Matteo added, "with swings?" "The best schools in the world," Richard replied, "and incredible parks, but only if everyone wants to go." The decision, when it came, emerged from family conversations that stretched over several weeks. They researched neighborhoods, schools, and cultural opportunities. They talked about adventure and homesickness, about the courage required to start over in a new place, and the comfort of facing challenges together. In the end, they chose adventure, not because the financial opportunity was too good to pass up, but because they had learned that family could be portable as long as love remained constant. The move to London became the next chapter in their ongoing story of chosen family and unconditional love. Richard's business thrived in European markets, while Alicia discovered that her gift for nurturing and guidance translated beautifully across cultural boundaries. Isabella and Matteo adapted to British schools with the resilience that comes from feeling securely loved, and their London home quickly acquired the same warmth and welcome that had characterized their Los Angeles mansion once Alicia's presence had transformed it from residence to home. But more importantly, the months in London proved that the bonds they had rebuilt were strong enough to withstand any external change. They had created something that transcended geography, circumstances, or cultural differences, a family held together not by legal obligations or financial dependencies, but by the daily choice to love each other completely and unconditionally. Years later, when Isabella and Matteo had grown into teenagers and then adults, when Richard's renewable energy empire had become a global force for environmental change, when Alicia's hair had turned silver and her hands showed the accumulated evidence of decades spent caring for others, they would still gather around dinner tables and share the kind of conversation that only comes from people who have chosen each other through joy and sorrow, success and failure, separation and reunion. And when people asked about the secret to their family's happiness and stability, Richard would always give the same answer. "We learned that love isn't something you manage or control. Love is something you honor, protect, and nurture when you're wise enough to recognize it and brave enough to choose it over everything else." The Martinez family had discovered that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars or Bitcoin or real estate portfolios. True wealth was measured in bedtime stories shared across decades, in laughter that echoed through houses in multiple countries, in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you belong to people who will choose you again and again, regardless of circumstances. Alicia, the humble nanny from East Los Angeles, who had given her heart to children she didn't birth, but loved as fiercely as any biological mother, had taught them all that family isn't determined by genetics or legal documents. Family is created through the daily choice to show up for each other with patience, presence, and the kind of love that sees beyond surface differences to the human heart beating underneath. And you, have you ever cared for someone who later forgot you? Have you ever loved with your whole heart, only to have that love dismissed as mere employment or professional obligation? Tell me your story in the comments. Because every woman who has ever loved other people's children as her own deserves to feel seen and valued. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs to remember that her love matters, that her sacrifice has meaning, that the invisible work of caring for others is the most important work in the world. For more stories that honor the silent heroes who hold our families together, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us. We'll meet again in our next story, where love always finds a way to triumph over fear, and hearts that give generously are never truly forgotten.